the lifeline, it can provide Egyptian water for growing crops, which led to the flourishing of civilization throughout the entire valley of the Nile. The riverbank that divided the Egyptian territory into two parts provided a favorable environment for the emergence of civilization. When the Nile Valley began in Miocene times, and until it acquired its current form, the diverse geographic features effectively contributed to the founding of the state. As a result of the annual floods that spread the fertile soil to the east and west over the centuries, silt deposits accumulated. When the water receded and flowed along its shores, beginning the agricultural year, Egypt became one of the first agricultural communities to exist in the history of humanity. At the end of the Paleolithic, the production of arrows became widespread. Harpoons, corn, baked stones, bone work, and ceramics. On the other hand, the carbon-14 tests were used by researchers to demonstrate that corn was harvested in a Neolithic silo located in the Fun Forces, 4600 and 4250 BC. Later, people built huts of reeds and solid clay, and sowed corn in the muddy soil of the Nile waterways. Ancient Egypt was divided into two territories, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt was to the north, where the Nile extended with its various branches until it formed the Nile Delta. Upper Egypt extended to Aswan in the south. The two kingdoms were unified in 3000 BC by King Narmer, but each retained its regalia, the Hedjit or white crown for Upper Egypt and the Desser or red crown for Lower Egypt. As a result, the pharaohs were known as the rulers of the two lands and bore the Egyptian crown, a double crown in which each half denoted the sovereignty of a different land. The pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt is the period before documented history, which covers approximately 6000 to 3150 BC. From the Paleolithic to the Neolithic and until the founding of the First Dynasty, there were no written records of this period. Archaeological excavations in Egypt have unearthed objects that convey the trace of the cultural history of the Nile River Valley, called the pre-dynastic period in the regions or ancient cities where these artifacts were discovered. Health and culture thrived until 30,000 BC in the zone between Egypt and Nubia, giving way to the Akkadian and Scythian cultures. Around 10,000 BC, the Harappan culture emerged. All of these cultures are hunter-gatherer societies that gradually became more sedentary and established permanent settlements based on agriculture. The Fun Oasis is a natural basin located next to the Geisa Plateau, which was home to the Fayum civilization between 9000 and 6000 BC. These people lived near a large lake and made a living from agriculture, hunting, and fishing. The inhabitants of Fun built cane houses with attics built to store food, domesticated sheep and goats, and prospered in basketry and pottery. Tribal chiefs assumed positions of power that they could pass on to the next generation of a family or tribal unit. Communities went from being tiny tribes that traveled together to large groupings of diverse tribes that always lived in the same region. The Fayum culture occupied the site of Merim between 5000 and 4000 BC, which received its name from the artifacts discovered at the site of that name on the western side of the Nile Delta. The prefecture of the Egyptians was agricultural, and agriculture was the basis of the economy of dynastic Egypt. Farmers depended on annual summer floods to grow their crops. We know that the first Egyptian farmers were hunter-gatherers. They sowed crops such as wheat, lentils, barley, flax, and peas, in addition to herding animals, according to what was found in a western part of the Nile Delta. The oldest levels of Merim to Beni Salami evolved between 800 and 4000 BC, in addition to Cuenca del Fu, both from Neolithic times. The convex terrain of the Nile Valley favored the development of several basins that in ancient times were flooded every year with waters that brought silt, fertilizing the soil. It is in these basins that deposits from ancient Egyptian irrigation systems were found. The graneros were formed by clay tenages or baskets that were buried up to the neck in the earth. The El Omri culture, around 4000 BC, developed these techniques. They built circular dwellings of greater complexity with revoked mud walls. All of these cultures evolved and flourished in Lower Egypt, north of Egypt, closer to the Mediterranean Sea, while the Upper Egyptian civilization formed later. The inhabitants of the Bavarian culture lived in mobile shops like their ancestors, but preferred permanent homes. After the Barbarian period came the Amratian period, also known as Naqada I, in which more complete dwellings were built with windows, chimneys, adobe walls, and curtains around the main entrance. The practice of mummification began around 3000 to 1500 BC, when funerary objects were still left in the tomb. These advances contributed to the culture known as Naqada II, the second period from 3500 to 3200 BC, which began trade with other regions and inspired changes in culture and art. Houses were built from sun-baked bricks, and the most opulent included courtyards, an addition that became common in Egyptian homes. Later, the city of Abydos, located north of Naqada, became an important burial site, and huge stones were built forming a necropolis, a city of the dead. These stones were built with clay bricks, but later huge polished limestone stones were used. Over time, the site became the burial place of Egypt's rulers. Despite this, evidence reveals that individuals from across the nation entered his chambers and delivered funeral gifts to commemorate his memory. At this time, the cities of Suez and Areopolis were considered ancient, while Tinis, Naqada, and Nikan were rapidly developing the hieroglyphic alphabet, which was invented between 3400 and 3200 BC, used to keep records. Complete sentences from this period have not yet been discovered. The oldest Egyptian writing discovered so far comes from Abydos and is found on pottery, clay seals, and ivory and oil objects. Complete prayers are not found in Egypt until the time of King Peribsen in the Second Dynasty, 500 years after this period. This period ended in the Naqada III period, between 3200 and 3150 before. From Christ. After Naqada III, the early dynamic period and recorded history of Egypt began with trade. Communities expanded and prospered, and those in Lower and Upper Egypt increased. The small villages of houses and brick buildings evolved until they became large urban centers that quickly competed, probably with the trade of products and water resources. Thinis, Nechem, and Hierapolis were the three main cities of the state of Upper Egypt during this period. Hierapolis appears to have defeated Niqum before absorbing her. These battles took place between Kings Scorpio I, Scorpio II, and Narmer, according to some researchers. Scorpio I, Scorpio II, and Ka were the last three rulers of the proto-dynamic period before King Narmer invaded and unified Lower and Upper Egypt, creating the First Dynasty. The early dynamic period in Egypt began between 3150 and 2613 BC, marking the beginning of the country's historical era, where Upper Egypt to the south and Lower Egypt to the north were unified as a single country under centralized authority. During that time, the divine rule of the monarch began and a distinct Egyptian culture emerged that included the development of writing, arts, and sciences. Menes, the first king of Egypt, was a ruler of Upper Egypt, presumably from Thinis or Hierapolis, who he defeated in the surrounding city-states before conquering Lower Egypt in 3150 BC. Narmer married Princess Nethotep of Naqada in an agreement to improve ties between the two cities, undertook military operations in Lower Egypt to focus revolts and expand his territory into Canaan and Nubia. He sponsored large construction and urbanization projects that developed throughout his reign. His son, Horus, succeeded in 3100 BC, continuing his father's military expansion and increasing trade. He was notably interested in religion and the concept of Ma'at, rising during his reign when the mastaba tomb was built. Horus was replaced by his son, Athoi, in 3000 BC, who married the princess Merniat and was considered to have assumed government of the nation through his death. It is not known for certain whether she ruled as regent for her son or as queen, but her reign stood out for being the first time that a woman ruled in ancient Egypt. In 2990 BC, he is considered the greatest monarch of the First Dynasty and reigned for 50 years. His reputation as an efficient monarch was due to his economic advances, his military conquests, and the stability of his government, as demonstrated by his costly construction projects and elaborate works of art. He was followed by two other monarchs, Agib and, later, Semerkhet, both with reigns marked by insurgency. The dynasty ended with the reign of Qa, during which his heirs fought for the throne and were defeated by Hetep-Sejemwi, who established the Second Dynasty. Internal struggles and lack of records or misunderstandings ruined the Second Dynasty, from 2890 to 2670 BC. None of the Second Dynasty monarchs have reliable dates, and several of the kings' names appear to be repetitions of previous rulers. Hetep-Sejemwi, which means two powers in peace, is a good example of this. as its name could seem like the power came through some princes who fought for the throne. After the COA, but his name is written at the entrance to the COA's tomb, which implies that he was the governor responsible for entering the COA and already had that name before establishing the War of Succession, unless much credit was given for having brought peace to Egypt through his accession to the throne. However brief, instability and rebellion marked his U of Saqqara is considered the first recognized pyramid in Egypt. Designed by its architect and vizier Imhotep, Imhotep was vizier, sage, architect, astrologer and main minister of Djoser I, pharaoh of the third Egyptian dynasty, who was later deified and venerated as the god of medicine in Egypt and Greece, where he was associated to the Greek deity of medicine, Asclepius. Imhotep is believed to have designed the stepped pyramid at the Memphis necropolis in Saqqara. This six-step pyramid is the oldest stone monument in the world. An inscription with his name on a statue of Djoser, discovered near the Saqqara pyramid, attests to his high status in Djoser's court. The inscription includes titles such as the leader of the sculptors and the chief of the seers. Historical documents describing Egyptian society and medicine throughout the Old Kingdom demonstrate that the chief magician of the pharaoh's court often served as the nation's chief physician. It became a basic mastaba monument with a flat top and sloping sides similar to many tombs of previous dynasties. The architect Imhotep at Cambio had more ambitious plans for the eternal abode of his king. The stepped pyramid is a succession of mastabas stacked one on top of the other, each step slightly smaller than the lower one to create a pyramidal shape. The previous mastabas were made with arched tiles, but the stepped pyramid was made with stones with tall motifs of trees and reeds. The middle stepped pyramid was finished 62 with the height that the convertia in the tallest building of its time to dissuade thieves and protect the corpse in the king's burial vault. The real chambers of the tomb were excavated beneath the cement as a labyrinth of passadizos with habitations outside the pasillos. However, this strategy did not work because the tomb was stripped of all its valuable objects, including the corpse of the king. In antiquity, only discovered his foot in the tomb. Despite the design and construction of the stepped pyramids, Ifan el Genio, in the vision of the builders of the Third Dynasty, who later raised the buried pyramid and the pyramid in capes among many other structures and sanctuaries, these first visionaries sat at the bases of the later royal pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, who were mesmerized and captivated a la gente during music. Millennia. The ancient kingdom of Egypt is also known as the Age of the Pyramids, or the Age of the Pyramid Builders, because it contains the Great Fourth Dynasty, during which King Seneferu mastered the art of pyramid building, and the Guéza pyramids were built under the reigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The historical documents from this time, 4th, 6th dynasties of Egypt, are scarce, and the historians consider that the history of the era is literally written in stone and is primarily architectural in the sense that scholars have been able to construct a history through the statues and their inscriptions. The pyramids themselves today provide information about their architects, but the funerary shrines and adjacent stelae provide the names of the kings and other significant data. In addition to the stones discovered in other places during the period, document different contents and dates in which they occurred. Lastly, the mausoleum of the last monarch of the Fifth Dynasty, a containment of the first pyramidal texts, detailed drawings, and writings inside from the tomb that shed light on them. Religious views of the time. During the ancient kingdom of Egypt, the elite standardized art and produced figures in a uniform manner to reflect the tastes of Memphis, the capital. Also, other forms of art such as painting and literature exhibit more skill in the Old Kingdom. The statues of the late dynastic periods and the Old-Time Kingdom are very comparable. The most famous works of art of the Old Kingdom are the Giza pyramids and the Great Giza outline, which are still preserved, although smaller. Structures were also built with the same precision and beauty. In reality, the Egyptians gave great importance to the art and architecture of the ancient kingdom. In later times, even all levels of society could share the same religious systems. Social inequality persisted even after death. The only significant impediment to reaching the afterlife was being buried outside of Egypt. The Egyptians thought that in order to be reborn, he had to be buried in Egypt. If he died abroad, his family would suffer enormous hardships. Expectations. He moved on to the Red Pyramid, located next to the Akhenaten Pyramid. This structure was built at a gentler slope of 43 degrees and is made of smaller stones, giving it a reddish appearance due to the type of stone used. The Red Pyramid was successfully completed, showing Seneferu's adaptability and determination to achieve his goal. These pyramids not only served as monumental tombs for kings, but also symbolized the stability and power of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians depended on grain reserves stored in granaries to compensate for lost crops, but also expanded their farmland through irrigation. The presence of everyday life in ancient Giza is witnessed by remains of priestly houses, sanctuaries, workers' quarters, and even beer stores. A common goal of honoring the gods and thanking them for their help. Especially important religious festivals included the festival of Opet, or the return of the deity in a procession boat to the temples. The celebration of New Year's to commemorate the birth of a new god of time was the most important festival of the year. The festival gave rise to many games and dances, as well as sporting competitions, music and plays, in which there were combat demonstrations, processions to temples with religious ceremonies, and various punishment offices around of the popes or commemorative katas were a common thing in ancient Egypt. With the gods after death and providing guidance for your journey into the afterlife, the pyramid texts are one of the most important contributions of the Old Kingdom period to Egyptian religion and spirituality. Despite his brief stay on the throne, Yunus is considered a significant ruler due to his innovation and the lasting influence of his deeds. Of political and social fragmentation in Egypt, the centralized power structures of the 6th dynasty were replaced by a system where local nomarchs gained more autonomy and control over their regions. This period also saw a weakening of royal authority, with the central government struggling to maintain cohesion and face internal and external challenges. During the transition to the First Intermediate Period, Egypt experienced a significant decentralization of political power. The provincial nomarchs, now strengthened, assumed more dominant roles, competing with each other for territorial control and resources. The pharaoh's central authority weakened further as previous dynasties left a leadership vacuum that was not readily filled by strong or unifying rulers. This period of political uncertainty and social instability was marked by regional disputes, rivalries between nomarchs, and a weakened economy. Internal and external crises contributed to the disintegration of the centralized government, with profound impacts on the cohesion of the Egyptian state.
Sarcófago. E quando fui para ela encontrei que lhe haviam nascido dos pájaros Y era o cultivo deu útero de la comunidade a la Rose Y morir ao 12º mês para o fundo deu ataúd que finalmente retiramos eu interesse por las escrituras de papiros de Mentotep IV terminou em 1986 a.C. no século de invasões asiáticas que marcaram o colapso do Reino Médio de Mentahotep III até o meio do seu reinado. Os escribas documentaram a aparência de uma estrela música cometa que diz que estava em breve passagem e ela aterrissou em Tebas e esse foi tomada como um sinal de que os deuses estavam descontentes com o governo das reformas da cultura egípcia que haviam introduzido desenhos novos novas instituições agora são abordados a publicidade passagens dos papiros que vão para conhecer uma cultura egípcia.
Of political and social fragmentation in Egypt, the centralized power structures of the 6th dynasty were replaced by a system where local nomarchs gained more autonomy and control over their regions. This period also saw a weakening of royal authority, with the central government struggling to maintain cohesion and face internal and external challenges. During the transition to the First Intermediate Period, Egypt experienced a significant decentralization of political power. The provincial nomarchs, now strengthened, assumed more dominant roles, competing with each other for territorial control and resources. The pharaoh's central authority weakened further as previous dynasties left a leadership vacuum that was not readily filled by strong or unifying rulers. This period of political uncertainty and social instability was marked by regional disputes, rivalries between nomarchs, and a weakened economy. Internal and external crises contributed to the disintegration of the centralized government, with profound impacts on the cohesion of the Egyptian state. Of the regions under his rule, he continued with major construction projects and consolidated central power during his reign. After his death, his son Amen-Seneb II ruled for a short period before being succeeded by his son Senusret III 1878 to 1843 BC, who reigned during one of the most prosperous and stable periods of ancient Egypt. Senusret III further consolidated central power and expanded Egypt's borders through successful military campaigns. He was a powerful and respected ruler whose reign is often seen as the apex of the Middle Kingdom. Senusret III is also known for his engineering works, including the construction of the Bar Yusuf Canal, which improved the irrigation system and facilitated trade and communication within Egypt. His son and successor Amen and Pharao 1843 to 1797 before Christ, he continued his father's policy and maintained the stability of the Middle Kingdom during his long reign. Amen and Pharaoh built temples and public works and promoted trade and diplomatic relations with other nations. His rule was marked by prosperity and cultural advancement. In Egypt, the reign of her successor, Amen and Pharaoh, also known as Sobinfur, marked the end of the 12th dynasty and the Middle Kingdom. She was the first and only woman to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, although her reign was relatively short, and his legacy was overshadowed by the turbulent events that followed his death. Sobinfuru is remembered as a significant figure in Egyptian history for his position as pharaoh in the early Second Intermediate period. With the quality of the Nile's water, as the river also served as a source of drinking water, and many Egyptians developed health problems related to drinking water contaminated by parasites and other pathogens, especially during the annual floods when the Nile's water mixed with stagnant water from surrounding areas. During the reign of Amenemhat III, between 1860 and 1814 BC, Egypt continued to prosper. He built extensive public works, such as Lake Moeris, a large reservoir that helped regulate the flow of the Nile's waters and control flooding. Amenemhat III is also known for his economic policies that promoted trade and agriculture, resulting in a period of stability and growth for ancient Egypt. However, after the death of Amenemhat III, Egypt gradually entered a period of decline known as the Second Intermediate period, marked by political fragmentation and foreign invasions that culminated in the fall of the pharaoh's centralized power and general instability in the country. This turbulent period lasted until the rise of the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom, when Egypt experienced a renaissance and a new era of glory. During the Middle Kingdom, specifically under the 12th dynasty, Egypt saw a period of renewed stability and prosperity. The pharaohs of this dynasty, such as Senusret I, also known as Senusret, Amenemhat II, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III, were responsible for great constructive and administrative feats that consolidated centralized power and promoted the economic and cultural development of ancient Egypt. Senusret I, who reigned from 1971 to 1926 BC, consolidated the conquests of his predecessor Mentuhotep II and extended Egyptian control over Nubia through successful military campaigns. He also initiated significant construction projects, such as the construction of fortresses and temples, which not only strengthened the borders but also promoted religious devotion to the king as an intermediary between the gods and the Egyptian people. Amenemhat II, who reigned from 1929 to 1895 BC, continued his father's expansionist policy and carried out successful military expeditions in Nubia and Sinai. He also strengthened the central administration and promoted trade, especially with the Levantine regions such as Byblos, thus improving Egypt's economy. Senusret III, who reigned from 1878 to 1839 BC, is considered one of the most powerful pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. He further expanded Egyptian territory to the Second Cataract of the Nile in Nubia through vigorous military campaigns. Senusret III is also known for his effective government and monumental construction projects, including the restoration of temples and the construction of fortifications along Egypt's borders between Asia and Egypt, including traders and immigrants. During the Middle Kingdom, specifically under the 12th dynasty, Egypt saw a period of renewed stability and prosperity. The pharaohs of this dynasty, such as Senusret I, also known as Senusret, Amenemhat II, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III, were responsible for great constructive and administrative feats that consolidated centralized power and promoted the economic and cultural development of ancient Egypt. Senusret I, who reigned from 1971 to 1926 BC, consolidated the conquests of his predecessor Mentuhotep II and extended Egyptian control over Nubia through successful military campaigns. He also initiated significant construction projects, such as the construction of fortresses and temples, which not only strengthened the borders but also promoted religious devotion to the king as an intermediary between the gods and the Egyptian people. Amenemhat II, who reigned from 1929 to 1895 BC, continued his father's expansionist policy and carried out successful military expeditions in Nubia and Sinai. He also strengthened the central administration and promoted trade, especially with the Levantine regions such as Byblos, thus improving Egypt's economy. Senusret III, who reigned from 1878 to 1839 BC, is considered one of the most powerful pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. He further expanded Egyptian territory to the Second Cataract of the Nile and Nubia through vigorous military campaigns. Senusret III is also known for his effective government and monumental construction projects, including the restoration of temples and the construction of fortifications along Egypt's borders. Amenemhat III, who reigned from 1860 to 1814 BC, completed many of the projects begun by his predecessors, including the construction of Lake Moeris, Birket Karen, a large reservoir that regulated the Nile's flooding and aided irrigation during periods of drought. He also promoted trade and agriculture, making his reign a period of stability and prosperity for ancient Egypt. These pharaohs of the 12th dynasty left a lasting legacy of monumental achievements that not only enriched Egypt in material terms, but also consolidated royal power and strengthened national unity during the Middle Kingdom. Eastern part of the country, from the Levant to Mesopotamia, until the end of the First Third Dynasty, the monarch of Egypt stopped supplying the border fortifications located in Nubia and no longer stationed soldiers there. The troops that were stationed in the forts never returned to Egypt, and the former garrisons became their permanent residence. These troops served as commercial intermediaries between the Egyptian city of Thebes and the kingdom of Kush. As the 13th dynasty neglected southern affairs, as had occurred in the north, the kingdom of Kush became a centralized power, with its capital at Kerma. Some of the ancient Egyptian fortifications along the border were destroyed at some point, presumably during an assault. Even if this is not clear, it is evident that as the Egyptian government and Thebes neglected influence to the south, Kush's power increased and the border became more flexible. The troops that were stationed behind no longer considered it their duty to protect against invasion and adapted more to the role of traders than soldiers. At this time, the monarchs documented for the latter part of the 13th and 16th dynasties are not Egyptians, or at least do not have Egyptian names, and are considered Ixt governors. Its chronology is confusing, and some names are known only from ceremonial objects, while others are only known from fragments of king lists, which makes dating difficult. The Ix achieved economic dominance of the eastern delta and soon advanced north, negotiating treaties and forging contracts with various nomarchs and governors of other districts of Lower Egypt. Eventually, they conquered a considerable amount of territory and were able to exercise their political authority. Once established in avarice, the Ix elevated Egyptians to positions of power. The Ix monarchs established the 15th dynasty of Egypt, but after the Thebans displaced them, they destroyed every trace of the Ix in Egypt. We know only a few names of Ix governors thanks to inscriptions and other texts discovered at Avaris and other sites. One of the best known was Pepi II, also known as Apophis, with an Egyptian name related to the giant serpent Apophis or Apep, the nemesis of the sun god Ra. While the Ix gained importance in northern Egypt, the Nubians rose to power in the south. The 13th dynasty of the Middle Kingdoms, like Lower Egypt, had neglected its southern border. Cha remained the capital of Upper Egypt, but instead of dominating the entire nation, it was boxed in between the Ix in the north and the Nubians in the south. According to Maneteo, Pepi II's Ix message written to the Theban king Sennacherib II in 1580 BC was to eliminate the state of hippos east of the city, which disturbed his sleep day and night. It is likely that the message referred to the Theban practice of the House of the Hippopotamus, which would have been insulting to the Ix, who worshipped Set and included the hippopotamus in their religious rituals. Boat, as a severe example of punishment. He then led several military campaigns north into Syria and Palestine, establishing the first Egyptian occupation of those lands. His aggressive military policy not only expanded Egypt's borders, but also secured lucrative trade routes and strengthened Egyptian influence in the region. Thutmose I was succeeded by his son, Thutmose II, 1520 to 1492 BC, who immediately began wars to expand Egypt's reach. He suppressed a revolt in Nubia shortly after ascending the throne, showing his determination to maintain control over the conquered regions. Thutmose II also established strategic alliances and continued the military campaigns begun by his father, further consolidating Egyptian rule over Palestine and Syria. These early rulers of Egypt's 18th dynasty not only solidified Egypt's security and power, but also paved the way for the splendor and imperial expansion that would characterize the new kingdom. His military and political conquests left a lasting legacy that shaped Egypt's history and profoundly influenced neighboring civilizations. Boat, as an announcement to other rebels, continued to extend Egypt's control over Nubia as far south before focusing on Palestine and Syria, expanded the famous Temple of Kak of Thebes, and built numerous other temples and structures throughout Egypt. Thutmose II, 1492 to 1479 before of Christ. The succession, but little is known about his government because he was quickly eclipsed by his more powerful sister JSBS 1479 to 1458 years of Christ was one of the most powerful and effective sovereigns of the New Kingdom, with a minor woman Thutmose III who named her successor 1458 to 1425 BC. After the death of Thutmose I, JSBS was appointed regent of Egypt and officially ruled with Thutmose III, but he was the driving force of her husband's mandate and continued to do it. In the year after his death, JSP took charge of many construction initiatives, directed the most successful expedition to the point of postponing his works on the Temple of Karnak, and governed in harmony with Nubia over his works were as beautiful and comprehensive as the later pharaoh's complaint about his property could be made, because the name of JSP was taken from all his structures, including his magnificent complex in Bari around the year 1458 BC, while the obelisks that originated in the different temples were symbols of sun gods, and many of them have been found all over the world. Since they are authentic Egyptian or modern ones imitating the ancient Egyptian obelisks, the process of creating one is not a paradox, since there is an unfinished one located in the granite pits, and Ajuan Hats commissioned its construction probably to accompany what was known as the Latran obelisk, which was originally in Karnak, but was later taken to the Latran Palace in Rome. Thutmose III inherited a rich and safe country in 1458 BC, and wasted no time in improving it. Thutmose III established the Empire Egypt that would sustain. His descendants defeated neighboring countries and expanded Egypt's rule further than ever before, using the war chariot acquired for iOS, bronze weaponry, and better strategies over the course of 20 years, directed at least 17 separate military campaigns, some kingdoms from Libya to Syria, and extended Egypt's authority south of the region around the well into Kyrgyzstan to very deep death as earthly power rose to the power to create the weak and inexperienced king of the Syrian city of Kadesh. Instigated a revolution in the Egyptian province of Canaan, which quickly regained support from elsewhere with the aim of destroying Egypt. This coalition met in the city of Megiddo. Thutmose's third march with its army from Thebes to Megiddo in northern Canaan, electing prudently a wide pass from the city of Aruna in place of the widest routes, and made the city, and surprised its enemies by launching into the valley behind their defensive positions and expelling them from the field at all times. Thutmose's third Tuvo, who besieged the city to be able to Chini her, who was commander and military scribe of Thutmose III, naturally accompanied his monarch in the war to quell the rebellion, and wrote an act describing the Thutmose's third fight that so captured Chini's account that he wrote parts of it on the walls of the great temple of Ammonius at Karnak, and to a lesser extent in other places, beginning to describe why the writings on the walls of the temple exist, then moving on to explain the campaign and its motivations. The wretched adversary referred to on several occasions is the king of Kadesh, who initiated the revolt and rallied the armies against Egypt, but was also used to refer to all who joined the rebellion through the Battle of Megiddo III, and sometimes punished those who participated in it by capturing not only Kadesh, Bel, also all of Syria and the Methanic territories of Mesopotamia. Succeeding his son Temenoth II 1425 to 1400 BC, who inherited and built upon his father's powerful and secure kingdom, was not a warrior king, but ordered many projects of construction and signed peace treaties and commercial agreements with other countries as Mitanni. Thutmose 1400 to 1390 BC. His replacement continued his programs based on the readings of his famous dream stele, which tells the story of his arrival in the kingdom. Thutmose is considered a usurper. Ankh is the legal son of Amino, is best known as the king who rebuilt the Great Pyramid of Giza, follows him to Minit-Tur in 1353 before Christ, considered one of the most effective and powerful governors of Egypt, and Minit-Tur III reigned Egypt at a time when found himself on his artistic, political, and fiscal cusp. His reign was one of the most opulent in Egyptian history, and the Menudo used his riches to persuade other nations that they did what he wanted. Maintaining the stability of the nation expanded in its borders, and he dedicated himself to the arts and construction initiatives. Many of the most impressive structures in Egypt, dating back to his reign, however, during his reign of the priests of Amun, they began to acquire more and more fortune, providing more properties than the monarch and using them to further enrich themselves. However, the third intention is to contain his growing influence, aligning himself with Aten, a minor deity symbolized by a solar disk, which appears to have created the pharaoh's authority after the Aten cult elevated. Thutmose III sometimes punished those who participated in the rebellion, capturing not only Kadesh but all of Syria and the Mitannian territories of Mesopotamia. His son, Amenhotep II, 1425 to 1400 BC, inherited and built upon his father's powerful and secure kingdom. Not a warrior king, Amenhotep II ordered many construction projects and signed peace treaties and trade agreements with other countries, such as Mitanni. Thutmose IV, 1400 to 1390 BC. His successor continued his programs based on the inscriptions on his famous dream stele, which tells the story of his accession to the throne. Thutmose is considered a usurper, although he is the legitimate son of Amenhotep II. He is best known as the king who rebuilt the Great Pyramid of Giza. His successor, Amenhotep III, 1390 to 1353 BC, is considered one of the most effective and powerful rulers in Egypt. Amenhotep III reigned during Egypt's artistic, political, and economic heyday. His reign was one of the most opulent in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III used his riches to persuade other nations to do what he wanted. He maintained the nation's stability, expanded its borders, and devoted himself to the arts and construction initiatives. Many of Egypt's most impressive structures date from his reign. However, during his reign, the priests of Ammonius began to acquire more and more wealth and influence. Ancient Egypt, re-establishing the cult of Ammon and other traditional gods. He began a military campaign to expand Egypt's borders and restore its international influence. Ramses I, 1295 to 1294 BC, was succeeded by his son Seti I, 1294 to 1279 BC, who continued his father's efforts to strengthen Egypt. Seti I restored and built several temples throughout Egypt, including the famous temple at Abydos, where he saw himself as a renewer of ancient Egyptian religious cults. Egypt, in addition to expanding the vast temple of Ammonius at Karnak, he gave Seti the authority to direct military missions to recover zones lost during Akhenaten's rule. At his death, Seti I ascended the throne and continued the reform and revival of Egypt, adding his own touches to Karnak's grand project and preparing his successor for rule. His son Ramses I, 1279 to 1213 BC, is the best-known pharaoh in Egypt today. Ramses II ruled Egypt for 67 years, and the magnificent temples and monuments he built to celebrate his conquests and achievements continue to testify to the wealth of his reign. There is no place in ancient Egypt that does not mention Ramesses II, and the story of his triumph at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC is legendary. However, one of his greatest acts as pharaoh was not one of battle, but of peace, the signing of the first peace treaty in history. The Hittites of Anatolia had gained prominence since the second millennium BC and, in 1530 BC, surpassed Babylon as a notable nation. They were challenging Egypt. Orm had fought unsuccessfully against the Hittites, who had become even stronger in the time of Tutankhamun, his successor. With the peace treaty established, Ramses II consolidated not only political stability, but also the legacy of one of the most prosperous reigns in ancient Egypt. His monuments erected to perpetuate his victories continue to inspire awe to this day, testifying not only to his greatness as a leader, but also to his vision of a united and powerful Egypt. As the years passed, Ramesses II saw his empire flourish in peace and prosperity. Under his leadership, Egypt reached new heights of cultural and economic development, establishing vigorous trade relations with other powers of the time. Egyptian arts and architecture flourished, driven by the stability and wealth brought by peaceful conquests and international trade. Ramesses II not only ensured the security of his kingdom, but also left a lasting legacy as one of the most revered pharaohs in history. His reign marked a golden age for Egypt, where peace